Good morning. My name is Yara Shoufani, and I'm an organizer with the Palestinian Youth Movement. I'm joined here today by Rachel Small, Alex Paterson, and Corey Balsam. We are convening today at 660 days of genocide, a genocide that has now reached a breaking point with a starvation campaign that is threatening to exterminate generations of Palestinians in Gaza. Humanitarian organizations have all corroborated that Gaza is on the brink, with the next few days being a critical juncture that will determine the survivors of the genocide in Gaza. For nearly 2 years, people across this country from all walks of life have raised their voices and taken action against this genocide. We have organized some of the largest anti-war demonstrations in Canadian history. We have emailed, called, and sat down for meetings with our elected officials. We have taken to the media with harrowing stories of the genocide in Gaza, which has killed tens of thousands of Palestinians and destroyed over 85% of Gaza's infrastructure. At the heart of our advocacy, and since the beginning of this genocide, there has been one clear and urgent demand: for the Canadian government to impose a comprehensive two-way arms embargo on Israel. This call has been amplified by the Arms Embargo Now coalition, an alliance of over 450 organizations representing millions of people, including major public sector unions, faith institutions, human rights and advocacy groups, and Palestinian-led organizations. Despite this overwhelming public pressure, and despite polling data showing that a majority of Canadians support the demand for an arms embargo, the Canadian government has chosen instead to lie about the nature of Canada's arms trade with Israel. In the past 2 years, Canadian politicians have deliberately misled the public into thinking that our material support for this genocide is insignificant, if not absent. But is transparency not a core value of democracy? The government's lack of transparency and dishonesty ends today as we release a new report authored by the Palestinian Youth Movement, World Beyond War, and the Arms Embargo Now coalition. This report lays bare, without a doubt, the true extent of Canada's ongoing material support for Israel amidst this genocide. It illustrates that despite deceptive government statements, the flow of military cargo from Canada to Israel has been uninterrupted. While thousands of Canadians marched right here on Parliament Hill during April's federal election, demanding an arms embargo, a shipment containing 175,000 bullets made its way from Canada to Israel. While Canadians called for an end to arms transfers, military cargo, the very tools of this genocide, were being loaded onto commercial passenger planes, flying alongside regular citizens going on holidays and visiting loved ones. This is the shocking reality that the Canadian government has tried to hide. Today's report places the Canadian government at a crossroads, as it must now choose: will it continue to arm Israel and mislead the public with vague statements about permit regulations, or will it choose a new path of transparency and heed to the demands of the people by implementing a comprehensive two-way arms embargo to stop the flow of weapons to Israel? And I'll now pass it on to Rachel.
Thank you, Yara. Good morning. My name is Rachel Small, and I'm the Canada lead for World Beyond War, a global organization and movement to end war and establish a just and sustainable peace. I'm joining you on Zoom instead of inside the press gallery today because, ironically, my accreditation was denied yesterday evening by the Office of the Sergeant at Arms because of my previous participation in protests in Ottawa to demand an arms embargo on Israel. Today, for the first time, we're unveiling the most detailed public snapshot to date of Canada's military support for Israel's assault on Gaza. Shipping records and Israeli tax authority data that directly contradicts repeated claims by our prime ministers and foreign minister that Canada had stopped sending weapons to Israel. The data in this report reveals the extent to which Canadian military products are deeply embedded in Israel's military infrastructure. And despite our government's attempts to placate us, to create the illusion of having addressed Canada's arming of Israel's attacks, we see clearly now that Canadian-made military goods have continued to flow directly to Israel this entire time, directly supporting Israel's capacity to carry out war crimes in Gaza and maintain its occupation of Palestine. I want to name now some of the specific things that we've uncovered in this report. Israeli import records show nearly 500,000 bullets, 421,070 bullets exported from Canada to Israel since this assault on Gaza began. These bullets were just a handful of the hundreds of weapons shipments identified for a range of military goods, including cartridges and other ammunition, aircraft engines, radar equipment, composite pieces of F-35 fighter jets, avionics, navigation systems, and electronic warfare systems. Many were shipped directly to Elbit Systems, Israel's biggest weapons company and the #1 arms supplier for the Israeli military. These were weapons parts shipped via Canadian highways, Canadian airports, rail lines, and ports from weapons manufacturers across Canada from coast to coast, including dozens of flights we tracked down out of Canadian airports that carried live military cargo under civilian passengers' seats. In September 2024, you may remember Minister Joly was confronted about the U.S. Department of Defense announcement that $83 million worth of mortar cartridges would be sold to Israel and manufactured at a General Dynamics factory in Quebec. Minister Joly was confronted about this and forced to respond, and she told journalists, and this is a direct quote from her, "We will not have any form of arms or parts of arms be sent to Gaza, period. How they're being sent and where they're being sent is irrelevant. And so therefore my position is clear, the position of the government is clear, and we're in contact with General Dynamics." End quote. This report has now uncovered a shipment of cartridges manufactured by General Dynamics in Repentigny, Quebec, and shipped to Tel Aviv that occurred 9 days after Joly's declaration. And we've just tracked down another one that left just 11 days ago. While government announcements and statements endlessly touted that they'd paused weapons permits in January 2024, they conveniently omitted the fact that they had rushed through the approval of a record-breaking number of permits for military exports to Israel immediately before this pause. This report demonstrates that this supposed pause did nothing to stop the flow of weapons to Israel because the government and industry ran through those hundreds of permit approvals before the pause, and these permits are still being used today to ship a constant stream of Canadian arms to Israel. This investigation exposes one of the biggest propaganda campaigns in Canadian foreign policy in decades. While Liberal ministers stood in Parliament claiming Canada had paused arms exports to Israel, nearly 500,000 Canadian bullets were shipped there. While Palestinian families buried their children under the rubble of Canadian armed airstrikes, fighter jet parts flew out of Halifax on Air Canada flights, hidden in the cargo beneath unsuspecting passengers. The government turned our national airline into a covert military transport service while telling Canadians they had stopped arms exports to Israel. Nothing can justify Canada continuing to supply weapons to a government that is deliberately starving children to death. This report shows that 175,000 military bullets were exported to Israel from Canada in April 2025. Since those bullets arrived just 3 months ago, over 1,000 Palestinians have been shot and killed at food distribution centers. The government's pause on arms exports was pure propaganda, a semantic game designed to fool the public while ensuring Israeli weapons manufacturers never lost access to Canadian military goods. This isn't bureaucratic oversight. This is systematic deception that has made Canada directly complicit in what most scholars and international organizations agree is a genocide. Hundreds of thousands of lives hang in the balance. Made in Canada weapons are directly supporting Israel's capacity to carry out war crimes and maintain its occupation of Palestinian territories. We have caught the Canadian government red-handed in its lies. And so now the Canadian government has a choice to make. Either they can continue to try to deceive the public, to issue empty statements about the need to take action while continuing to ship weapons, or they can end Canada's role in this machinery of death today by immediately imposing a complete two-way arms embargo on Israel. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Paterson, and I am the Senior Director of Strategy and Parliamentary Affairs with Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. Honestly, I feel nothing but regret in having to be here once again to raise the alarm on Canada's continued transfers of arms to Israel. You know, I'm an idealist at heart. That's what's fueled my advocacy for over 2 decades. There's been a part of me that believed if given the right information, Canada's institutions would function correctly and justly and make decisions based on the rule of law and the evidence at hand. I thought maybe we were on the right track when on March 18th, 2024, the House of Commons symbolically voted to end transfers to Israel. I've kind of stubbornly and desperately clung to the belief that is core to our national identity, that we would always stand up for civilians and human rights, that we were all hardworking, rational actors with moral centers at our core. You know, kind of the Canadian identity of peacekeepers who protect the little guy, the good guys, just straight up Canadians. I can't pretend to believe that story anymore after this report. Not with the shocking reality of our arms trade with Israel throughout a 1.5 years of this US-backed genocide. Any naivety I have left has been shattered by the galling reality that Canadian officials find it permissible for Canadian corporations to profit off the endless slaughter of Palestinian women and children. You know, I am a father. I see my young daughter every time I look at a picture of those children in Gaza, the ones starving, the ones burned alive in their makeshift tents, the ones shot in the mousetraps set up by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Quite simply, 925 babies under 1 year old have died in this genocide. 925. Arming these atrocities is supposed to be illegal under our own laws. Canada's Export and Import Permit Act is supposed to stop the transfer of arms where there's a risk of serious violations of international law. And yet, we still sell arms to Israel. I can't pretend that a simple coat of white paint will cover up the blood splattered room that is our institutions right now, and they'll suddenly look good again. If there's a thread of hope left for our credibility of our institutions, it starts with overhauling Canada's laws to fully adhere with the Global Arms Trade Treaty. And in the meantime, we need an immediate full two-way arms embargo using the Special Economic Measures Act. Quite simply, for the government, this means not a single bullet, not a single F-35 part made in Canada should be reaching Israel, directly or through the US. Not a single part should come from Israel to be repaired here and returned to Israel. Not a single procurement contract should be signed with Israel's war industries like Elbit Systems. That's what a real arms embargo would be, and that's what we've been denied by the Canadian government. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand and Prime Minister Mark Carney could make it happen overnight with a single regulation under SEMA, nearly a single stroke of a pen, and it could all be over. But they haven't, just like Trudeau and Jolie before them. I'm left with the inescapable conclusion that they don't want to stop it. And that's the crime. They have an obligation to prevent war crimes, and they're not.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Balsam, je suis le coordonnateur national de Voix juives indépendantes, une organisation pan-canadienne juive qui milite côte à côte avec des Palestiniennes et Palestiniens afin que leurs droits et leur vie soient respectés, honorés et réalisés. Je prends la parole aujourd'hui au nom de nos membres, de nos comités locaux à travers le Canada et le Québec, et au nom des dizaines de milliers de Juifs et Juives canadiennes qui exigent un embargo total et immédiat sur les armes avec Israël. Vous avez entendu les détails macabres révélés par ce rapport. Près de 400 livraisons de matériel militaire sont parties du Canada vers Israël depuis octobre 2023, y compris près d'un demi-million de balles. Des pièces d'armes fabriquées au Québec, envoyées 9 jours seulement après que le gouvernement ait promis de bloquer ces exportations. De nouveaux permis d'exportation accordés en février 2025, y compris pour les explosifs. Et pourtant, le gouvernement nous a dit le contraire. La Chambre des communes a adopté une motion, comme mentionné mon collègue, en mars 2024, déclarant qu'il allait mettre fin, c'est une citation, fin à toute nouvelle autorisation et tout nouveau transfert d'exportation d'armes vers Israël. L'ancienne ministre Mélanie Joly nous a assuré que le Canada n'exporte pas d'armes létales à Israël. Le premier ministre, Carney, prétend que le Canada fait sa part, qu'on a déjà un tel embargo. Mais au contraire, ce rapport montre clairement que ces affirmations étaient trompeuses et dans bien des cas, des mensonges. Ceci n'est pas seulement une question de politique étrangère ou de commerce militaire. C'est une trahison morale. C'est une trahison de la confiance du public et un affront à toutes celles et tous ceux qui ont cru aux engagements du Canada à défendre les droits humains et de jamais plus permettre qu'un génocide se déroule sans réponse. Combien de fois avons-nous entendu nos dirigeants répéter le slogan « Plus jamais, never again » à propos du Rwanda, de la Bosnie, de la Shoah, bien sûr. Mais que valent ces mots s'ils ne s'appliquent pas maintenant, alors qu'un peuple est en train d'être décimé, que les massacres ont lieu devant nos yeux en temps réel avec des balles canadiennes? Peu importe qui le perpétue, qu'il soit un pays, soit disons allié ou pas, un génocide est un génocide. Nous avons l'obligation d'agir, de ne pas aider les responsables et de faire tout en notre pouvoir pour y mettre fin. Les mots ne suffisent pas. Le moment pour les sanctions sur Israël, dont un vrai embargo sur les armes, c'est maintenant. Pas dans 6 mois, pas après que le Cour international de justice rende sa décision complète qu'il s'agit bien d'un génocide, il sera trop tard dans tous les cas. Surtout, pas après une haute déclaration vide et mensongère. Maintenant. Merci.
Hi there. I was wondering about what's new in the report. It seems like it's the customs data is the new part. When I go through the citations, it seems the rest has sort of been, reported before, was sort of publicly known before. The new part is customs data. And can you describe, if I'm asking if that's accurate, and if you could maybe describe how you found the customs data, what it tells us?
Yeah, of course. So there's 2 new components of the report. One is the customs data, which is extracted from the Israeli Tax Authority. And this was found through a really kind of rigorous hundreds of hour sifting through the Israeli Tax Authority portal directly. And the way that this data is classified is through particular classification codes. And so we were actually able to use classification codes and extract particular classification codes in order to see exactly, for example, how many bullets were exported from Canada to Israel, right, through looking at Israeli import data, which would have a distinct classification code with regards to, let's say, bullets or cartridges, which are classified under weaponry. And so this is a really critical component of the data. And then another new component of the data is commercially available shipping codes, right? And so when you look at the report and you see the detailed shipments, which trace, for example, shipments coming out of, for example, General Dynamics going to Israel, which have been mentioned by my colleagues, these shipments are being extracted through commercially available data, and they actually, provide a very small snapshot of the broader picture that exists within the Israeli Tax Authority data.
Able to glean from the permits that you can see what is being sent, or are those permits just transparent? I mean, what does Canada publicly make available that would give you information about what's being shipped?
Yeah, maybe I'll take this, and then Rachel, if you have thoughts to add, I think that'd be great. But really, when it comes to Canada's permit regime, this is a very untransparent sort of system. And so, even thinking about the fact that this report should have been a report that actually the Canadian government put out, right? To be able to show the public exactly what it is and is not shipping to Israel, right? Instead, it was mostly volunteers, a lot of people personally affected by this genocide, who worked through to produce this report, and actually had to go and extract data from corporations and from the Israeli Tax Authority. And then to be able to so while those two sets of data are quite different but complementary, we're not then able to fully corroborate it with Canada's permit regime, because Canada's permit regime is so untransparent. And so it would be impossible for us, unless Canada were to be more transparent about its permit regulation or what permits it continues to have active, we would not actually be able to go and say, well, this exact shipment corresponds with this particular permit, unfortunately. But I don't know, Rachel, if I've missed something that you'd like to add.
I think this is a really important point to make, because first of all, it has taken fighting tooth and nail to get the Canadian government to release any information whatsoever about the permits that it has approved and paused and suspended and reapproved for Canadian arms to be exported to Israel. And when some of that was finally released via the Foreign Affairs Committee, it was heavily redacted. And all of that just shows permits. So permits that were approved by the Canadian government for exports. What this report shows is shipment. So this shows the actual flow of weapons from Canada to Israel, something that the Canadian government has never even pretended to show. And in fact, the Canadian government has been denying this whole time that weapons have actually been moving to Israel. What we didn't expect to find in this report, and when researching it was completely shocking, was to note the ways in which many of these shipments are traveling. We never expected to find Canadian weapons parts moving on commercial flights underneath passengers while moving from weapons factories in Canada to, for example, Elbit systems in Israel. That was a shocking revelation for us to see the ways that Canadian infrastructure is implicated, and frankly, the way Israeli weapons manufacturers require it in order to receive their weapons of war.
Could you just explain something else too?
Just a little bit more on the follow-up. So I think what needs to be remembered as well is that to get the permits given to Parliament, there had to be a motion by Heather McPherson that was watered down by the Liberal Party to even get those permits to the Foreign Affairs Committee in the first place. And just so everyone's aware, with the prorogation of Parliament, they've been scrubbed. I went on the website this morning to see if I could look up the permits, and they're gone again. What the government likes to do is roughly in May of every year is give us an aggregate report on what has been sent country by country, like number of permits issued and number of permits utilized. And then they break it down by categories that line up and are aligned with the Arms Trade Treaty. So Canada has not been transparent at a disaggregated level about what they send. What is kind of reestablishing a good baseline for transparency, and what is kind of groundbreaking about this report, is that we have the data of individual shipments, and they're lined up with the timeline of when the ministers and the officials made different statements on a case-by-case basis, proving the misdirection and misinformation from the ministers in their statements saying that Canada wasn't transferring arms. Because if you remember back on March 18th, they said no new permits, and no new transfers. And then they've been hiding that they've been doing both of those things. So I think it's just important to remember that context.
And we've seen different language about what can be allowed to go to Israel. You know, at first we heard that there would be no transfers to Israel from Prime Minister Trudeau. I think that was February 2024. Then they began to talk about not sending lethal equipment. More recently heard equipment that could be used in Gaza. So what's your understanding currently of what criteria the Canadian government applies to this partial ban on shipments to Israel?
I mean, I'm not going to get too technical. Whatever they can get away with, whatever the public doesn't know, they're going to try and ship. Tell me how we could possibly track, once it gets to Elbit Systems, where those weapons actually go. How can we know that this F-35 is flying over Lebanon and bombing people in Dahya neighborhood? Fine, totally cool with that. But this one that flies over Bet Hanoun and bombs people, that's not allowed. It's kind of a Monty Python-esque macabre type of performance art that we're doing right now about where Canadian parts are allowed to be used. And the point of the Arms Trade Treaty is that you're not supposed to carve out these little designated zones around the world where Canadian arms can't be used by an actor that is committing war crimes. It's supposed to be a blanket rejection and prohibition of sending arms to an actor, a state actor, where they could be used in serious violations of international law or facilitate. It's commit and facilitate. So our drone cameras that allow someone on an unarmed drone that allow with F-35 to do a bombing run later, that's facilitation of the killing of civilians if it kills civilians. We have to remember that. So that's one of the core problems with the idea of lethal versus non-lethal that the government used as a communications ploy. Night vision goggles, non-lethal, can be used by a sniper to shoot someone at night, therefore making them a facilitator of a war crime. So that was something cooked up in the comm shop to misdirect us. And the reality is that is not a distinction that exists in law.
En français, si vous pouvez décrire ça, c'est possible. Quelqu'un en français sur comment au départ on a parlé le gouvernement parlait de l'équipement, ne pas envoyer d'équipement vers Israël, ensuite c'était l'équipement létal, ensuite l'espèce de transition, la confusion, tout ça. Comment on doit décrire en ce moment ce qui est interdit et ce qui est permis et le manque de transparence? Pouvez-vous préciser ça?
Je ne sais pas si j'ai beaucoup à rajouter, mais en français, oui. Donc, le fait c'est que le gouvernement change toujours comment il décrit qu'est-ce qui est interdit et qu'est-ce qui est accepté. À un moment, c'était pas létal, ça c'était clair de Mme Joly, qu'on n'allait pas envoyer de l'équipement létal. Après, on voit dans le rapport que c'est clair, on a des balles, on a d'autres types de munitions. Donc ça, c'est faux. Après, c'était interdit qu'ils aillent à Gaza. Okay? Mais après, comme ma collègue a expliqué, on ne sait jamais, et c'est probable que ces balles et d'autres armements sont allés à Gaza. En ce moment, je ne sais pas exactement c'est quoi le plus récent. Je ne sais pas si mes collègues ont des détails les plus récents de qu'est-ce qui sort du comm shop du ministre Anand là-dessus. Mais voilà, pour nous, ça ne veut rien dire.
Mais juste la démarche, comme ce que votre équipe a fait pour aller trouver ces chiffres-là. Puis aussi, est-ce que vous en avez parlé avec des représentants du gouvernement? Comme est-ce que vous avez eu une réponse, une justification des chiffres que vous avez trouvés?
Je vais laisser ma collègue Rachel peut-être parler des communications avec le gouvernement. Mais oui, peut-être en français. Mais oui, je comprends. Oui. Donc, c'était principalement des codes d'importation du côté israélien, des customs codes des Israéliens, qui nous mène à voir qu'est-ce qui est envoyé, comme les balles et d'autres types de munitions, et du data des données qui est disponible de qu'est-ce qui est envoyé du Canada. Donc, c'était vraiment de rentrer dans ces détails, des documents très, très détaillés avec des codes spécifiques qui sont universels, en fait, qui sont internationaux, des deux côtés, et de comparer et de voir, de nous donner un portrait de qu'est-ce qui se passe.
Vous expliquer qu'est-ce que le gouvernement a à gagner à pas montrer ces chiffres-là selon vous? Quand vous regardez les chiffres que vous nous présentez aujourd'hui, comment vous expliquez, ce serait quoi la raison, vous croyez, que ça se passe?
Je pense que ce qui se passe à Gaza est pas du tout populaire parmi les citoyens canadiens. Ils veulent, je pense, montrer qu'ils ne sont pas complices. Il y a aussi des côtés légaux. Le Canada a signé la Convention contre le génocide, the Arms Trade Treaty, plein d'accords comme ça qui interdit ce genre de commerce pendant des crimes de guerre et tout ça s'il y a une risque qui sont utilisés pour les crimes de guerre. Donc, je pense qu'ils essayent, un, de se protéger légalement, et deux, de dire un peu ce que le public veut entendre, même si ce n'est pas le cas.
Une question en français, je vais faire quickly in English after that for having the whole reaction. So, vous avez des alliés au Parlement. Il y a eu plusieurs, c'est pas la première fois que vous êtes là. Il y a eu plusieurs députés qui sont venus du NPD, du Bloc et des libéraux. Il y a eu une motion, mais il n'y a aucune action concrète, en tout cas sur les armes. Il n'y a aucune action concrète. Donc, qu'est-ce qui vous fait penser que ce rapport chiffré détaillé va faire changer politiquement quelque chose et rapidement? I'm doing that in English. So you have allies here in the Parliament. What makes you think that this report, which is detailed, is going to change something on the arms embargo? So if I have an answer in French and English.
Les deux.
Thank you.
Donc, oui, c'est vrai qu'on a des alliés. On est à, je ne sais pas combien, 36 peut-être députés qui ont signé pour la campagne de l'embargo sur les armes. Pardon? Et des sénateurs. Oui, de plus en plus de sénateurs aussi. Donc, des Palestiniens s'engagent là-dedans. Et donc, là, je pense que c'est juste encore une preuve que le gouvernement n'est pas transparent et en fait, qu'il essayait de nous tromper là-dessus. Et donc, oui, on pense que ça va, et on espère que ça va faire une différence quand ça devient public, tout ça. J'espère que des journalistes qui sont dans la chambre maintenant vont bien l'expliquer au public et rentrer en mois de septembre, je pense, dans la Chambre commune, ça devrait être une question. Et même maintenant, j'espère que les gouvernements vont répondre et changer leur voix.
Je pourrais aussi
I think-
répondre un peu en français si ça vous plaît. Vraiment, nous ne pouvons pas savoir ce que le gouvernement choisira de faire pour l'instant, mais il a un choix à faire maintenant. Soit il continue de tenter de tromper le public, de faire ses déclarations sur la nécessité d'agir tout en continuant à expédier des armes, ou il peut mettre fin au rôle du Canada dans cette machine de mort d'Israël. Il peut imposer immédiatement un embargo total sur les armes à Israël. Et je suis convaincue que le gouvernement sait ce qu'il faut faire pour se ranger du bon côté de l'histoire. Alors, on attend maintenant pour que le gouvernement prenne son choix.
Of course, we cannot guarantee or cannot know directly how the Canadian government will react to this report, but there's a few things I think that are important to note. First of all is the fact that there has been immense public pressure that has taken place over the course of the last 21 months. And arguably, some of this public pressure is likely what created even the statements that we're referring to in terms of Melanie Joly, in terms of the symbolic statement to pause permits. And so this came out of a direct result of public pressure. We also know that the statement with regards to general dynamics also came in response to public pressure. And so part of what we're doing with this report is also trying to offer it to the Canadian public, which does not have this information, right? So regular people across Canada who are deeply concerned with what's taking place in Gaza are not being given an accurate representation of Canada's role within that. And so the hope certainly is also that the Canadian public is able to react, Canadian institutions, that popular institutions, unions, faith-based organizations are able to react to this report, and I think we can guarantee for many of these members of the public will find the contents of this report shocking, and will certainly be hoping to take that up with their members of parliament, with their elected officials. And then there's also the added element, which is the question of whether members of parliament actually know what's in this report. Right? Because as my colleague mentioned earlier, even the permit regime sort of system required for members of parliament to try to gain higher levels of transparency with regards to what permits are active. And so there's also a broader question of whether members of parliament themselves are aware or have also been misled by the shipments that are ongoing to Israel over the course of this genocide.
Thank you. That's all the time we had. This concludes the press conference. Merci, c'est tout le temps que nous avions. Ceci conclut la conférence de presse.